Hi everybody, as promised, I'm going to be less long-winded today. So let's make this happen. First of all, this picture right here is a picture of the French estates coming together right before the French Revolution and sort of trying to form something different. And that's what we're really talking about today is we're going to talk about what this term here means, the public. It becomes this new idea. Again, when I say new, obviously it developed over this time, but it becomes a thing in the 1700s. Let's talk about it. So what we're going to do is we're going to talk about England. We're going to start there. We're going to start with this thing called the 7 Years' War. Now, you can read all about that, so I'm not going to go into it. It's not even that I really want you to know the 7 Years' War. This is just sort of the background to the story. So the prime minister is this guy named William Pitt the Elder. And William Pitt the Elder, during this war, he wants to fight France's trade, not France. Meaning, if the English land troops on France, they're going to get chewed up. So if we actually fight a war with them, who's the we? William Pitt, then England's going to get crushed. But England controls the seas, and so if they can just cut off France's trade all over the world, that's a win. And so there's these big British victories all over the world. Now, in Europe itself, Britain doesn't do that great. But all over the world, and again, Britain and France are really all over the world at this point, do pretty well. Here's the problem. Pitt's critics, they had a problem with this. They said, look, if England starts to take over trade all over the world, that's just going to make England a target for everybody else. They're all, just like everybody sort of ganged up against Louis XIV in France 100 years ago, that's what's going to happen to them. So what ends up happening is King George III, that's the guy he's the guy in Hamilton. King George III removes Pitt because he didn't like this guy anyways. All right, so the war ends. England ends up giving back almost everything it won because of this argument right up here, that essentially if it would have held on to everything it won, England would have just been look how great we did, we're the power in the world, and they would have spent the next 100 years trying to fight that off. Now here's the deal. The cities that paid for this war, this 7 Years' War, they were ticked. Why fight this whole war if we're just going to end up giving everything back? The cities were not happy. And London, of course, was the big one that just was not happy. And they blamed two people. They blamed the monarch, who valued personal power over national power. And that's going to be an important distinction, personal power and national power. So when we talked about Louis XIV, we never actually used this language, but Louis XIV is famous for saying, "L'état c'est moi," which essentially means, I am the state. The king is the sovereign. He has the sovereign power over the state. In England, it develops differently. Remember that absolutism versus constitutionalism. And even though the king might think that he is the person in charge of the nation, the king is really, it's personal power. It's not national power. The nation is the people of England. It's not the person of the king, and that's going to be a big distinction that comes up. The second thing they blamed was a corrupt parliament. Parliament was in the back pocket of the king. Parliament was supposed to be there representing the people, and it wasn't doing it. All right. That's your setup. So this debate happens in the 1760s. So after the war's over in 1763, they fought this whole war. It was really expensive. They won, but they don't really get anything from it. The debate of the 1760s is this. George III then tries to reassert the king's authority, and he tries to put in place that enlightened despotism that we talked about, just like with Frederick the Great, Catherine the Great, all those kind of. He wants to sort of say, I'm the king, I'm going to do this, I'm going to do this, I'm going to use reason to make England better. The radicals said no. This group of people called the radicals, and they're largely in the cities, opposed this idea of the king. The king is not the thing in charge of England. The people should be the thing in charge of England. Remember John Locke? When we talked about John Locke, it was essentially this idea of a social contract where the people hire the king, and if they don't like the king, they fire the king. But the king, in and of himself, does not hold any sort of separate power apart from what the people give them. This is the idea of the radicals, which we would not call radical today. We would just say that's democracy. But this is a very different idea. Where are these debates happening? The debates are happening in several places. Number one, they're happening in this new thing called the press. There's a lot more media outlets. And by this, I obviously don't mean internet or anything like that. I just mean there's a lot of newspapers, journals, pamphlets, things like that. More people are reading and more stuff is being produced to read. And of course, you're going to, the radicals are going to jump in on that, and they're going to have all this sort of media that sort of supports their idea of how this should work. Another place the debates are happening is in the coffee houses and the ale houses. Basically, the bars, coffee houses, people, again, this literate group of people get together and they discuss. And they are talking about these issues in a way that, again, if there's not this thing called the public, the people, then why meet and discuss? You're just basically talking about stuff that's happening, way over there that has nothing to do with you. But now, if the people are the sovereign, then the people meeting and discussing is the public at work. Political discussion becomes the entertainment of choice. Like, this is what you do, is you get together and you have these chit-chats. We talked a little bit about this in France. In this time, they had these things called salons, where the very rich kind of came together and did the same thing. So that leads us to this guy named John Wilkes. He does have cross eyes. He's sort of the figurehead of the radical movement, sort of the person the personification of this movement. And you saw a little bit about him in that video. Wilkes was a member of parliament, hated that 1763 peace. He was sort of this like, oh my gosh, I cannot believe, why did you ask the people to spend all this money just so that you could give the stuff back, King George, and look like you're super awesome. So he ends up being arrested. After he's arrested, he ends up suing the government, which is a weird idea. To us, it's not a weird idea today. You just sue the government all the time. But at the time, you're suing the government. It's a brand new idea. I mean, the government owns the courts. So how are you suing them? But this is a new sort of idea that when you're suing the government, you're sort of suing the king, the way the king thinks about things. And this wins the beginning of some key liberties we think about today that end up, again, 1763. So the 1760s, they're going to become part of the Declaration of Independence. They're going to become part of the Constitution. Freedom of the press is a key idea that comes out of this. And protection from illegal searches. Things, again, that we just notice in the Bill of Rights and we just say, it's cool. So he becomes the embodiment of liberty to many. Now, here's the question I want to ask. How might news of what was going on with Wilkes back in England have impacted the American colonists? Again, 1776 is when the colonies are going to start doing their thing. This is the 1760s, essentially. How do you think that's going to affect that? So we're going to talk about the public sphere. So you're going to watch this video on a guy named Habermas. Habermas was a guy who was writing in the 20th century, not way back then. But he sort of starts to put together some of these ideas about the public sphere. And we'll talk about that when we come back.